Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Center. We are now halfway through our series on the idea of home. And having looked at the concept of home through the lenses of philosophy, literature, history, biology, and environmental science, we turn today to something somewhat different. The question of the relation of home to patterns of migration and immigration. And I'm delighted to have with us today two very special guests who will offer their reflections on this vital topic. Rebeca Cazares Adame is Director of the Cross-Border Initiatives and leads the Border Fellows Program at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice here at USD. She has a background in medicine and public health, having received both her MPH and her MD from the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California. Her work focuses on health, migration, violence prevention, harm reduction, and peace-building efforts at the US-Mexico border. Previously, she worked at Prevencasa, a community-based organization in Tijuana, Mexico, where she provided health and harm reduction services to underserved populations in the city's red light district. Dr. Adame is part of the Tijuana Socio-Environmental River Project, a binational interdisciplinary research team studying the impacts of structural violence and environmental degradation in the Tijuana River Canal. Esteban del Río received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, having previously earned his bachelor's degree here at USD. He is professor in the Department of Communication and serves as the director of the Francis G. Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. Prior appointments at USD include Associate Provost, Director of the Center for Inclusion and Diversity, and he is currently chair of the college's Academic Assembly. A specialist in media and cultural studies, Dr. Del Rio's work focuses on how human unity and difference operate in informational and entertainment culture. His essays have appeared in the Journal of Communication Inquiry, Communication Culture Critique, and the Metropolitan University's Journal, among many other places. Dr. Del Rio's current research explores institutions and justice, promotion and authenticity in sports, communication, and the Catholic cultural roots of communication theory. We are really, really delighted to have you both with us. So please give a warm welcome to Rebeca Cazares Adame and Esteban del Rio. And Dr. Del Rio's going first.
Appreciate it. I was just actually submitting changes to my faculty bio this morning, because things change over time, and even some of those things, I'm like, there is no Center for Inclusion and Diversity anymore. They changed the name, so that's going to be off of the bio because I'm not sure people would know what it references. That's okay. I'm happy to talk about it, but that's a different talk. Really happy to be here today. On a kind of typical Tuesday, I've been talking all day, and I'm delighted to be here with Rebecca and the rest of you to keep talking, but in maybe a little bit of a different way in the conversations that I've had throughout the day. What I want to talk a little bit about and what I'm going to move through, and I have colleagues here, experts. I've got people who I know are curious, folks who are, have expertise around immigration, migration, communication, and then there's also lots of people who were just kind of wondering. So, just kind of try to make a few moves here. The first thing I want to talk a little bit about is a communication approach to both the idea of migration or immigration and home, and how, as a communication scholar, I would be approaching these concepts and how I've approached them in my work. I also want to kind of make a second move to think about how, from a cultural studies perspective and a communication perspective, that the text is really, if you study a text, it's really a window into context. The context of something is actually the object of study. even though we often look at texts. But the text, again, I would have disagreements with my colleagues and sometimes in literary criticism and things like that, but it's the context from my perspective as a communication and cultural studies scholar, it's the context that is really the site of analysis. The text itself, the example, is a window into the context. So I want to talk a little bit about the context surrounding issues of migration, immigration, and home. And I'd also like to explore text, and hopefully I leave enough time for it, but to think particularly about an example where home and migration are unified into a kind of a coherent idea. And the example is the Tenement Museum in New York City, which some of you may have already been. Jackie Hidalgo here from THRS was on a trip with me. I'll talk briefly about that. And if I have time, I have like a little video if you've never been. So communication approach to migration and to home. I think it's important to remember that from a communication perspective, and again, I would probably disagree with even some people in my department, right? Communication is a broad, kind of interdisciplinary area, but it's also very rooted in, rhetoric and persuasion. So it has manifested, communication has manifested different ways in the Western Academy over the last few thousand years. Everything from rhetoric to technological innovation, to proxemics and nonverbal communication, to family communication, psychological perceptions and motives, more sociological trends. I'm definitely coming from a particular place within my discipline, which is a cultural studies kind of site to operate from. And so I think it's important to recognize that communication from this perspective, the messages that make up communication, the symbols, the language, the messages that attempt to produce meaning, and the way that people receive these messages or interact with these messages and create their own kind of meaning. The communication doesn't just tell us about the world. It doesn't just represent the world for us, okay? And I think when I even first started studying communication, I was kind of thinking more in this way. There's a world out there, and that communication does the work of telling us about it, right? Of describing it. And we would be critical of those messages if we thought they weren't terribly accurate, okay, in how they were describing reality. Okay, on a very basic level, if we were to say today was a beautiful day, it was sunny, a little bit of cloud cover, a light breeze. It's actually really lovely, especially after a pretty oppressively warm midday weekend. We would match the language, the imagery that I'm creating, or if I was making a short video about it for my TikTok feed, we would match the language, the kind of messages that I'm using, and we would say, oh yeah, he's right. It is a day that was a little bit of cloud cover, a nice breeze, things like that. Okay? And I think a lot of times people make the mistake of thinking about communication only in that way. And I think that it makes sense, right? Communication does tell us about the world. I'm describing my ideas about migration and home, and hopefully you understand it, and I'm encoding it in such a way that you can decode it and we can kind of share space. Communication is a much more, and I found this out really in graduate school, is a much more kind of radical endeavor where we understand that communication doesn't just merely tell us about the world and tell us about reality, but social reality is created in and through communication. That communication is the place where we create our reality. James Carey, the luminary in communication research in the 20th century, talked about the daily miracle of creating our own reality and living under conditions of our own making, in a really famous essay. And I think that elevates what communication is. Communication is where we create reality. The university, when Bishop Buddy invited the sisters of the RSCJ with their Stanford PhDs to come and create a university, right? They had to persuade each other and make moves in order to make this place. They had to talk about it. They had to decide about it. They had to render designs. They would critique it. They made all kinds of moves. In other words, the very materiality of our university is the result of communicative processes. Communication doesn't just describe the university. Communication created the university. How is it that we ended up With Mission Bay, we had a terrific, beautiful wetlands in San Diego. Unbelievable. There was a duck hunting club in early San Diego history. There's just imagine all of what is now this aquatic park with jet skis was a huge salt marsh. Just on the edges, can you get a sense of that now? It must have been absolutely beautiful. When the Spanish first began their colonization here, they called it the False Bay, because like any salt marsh, high tide, it comes up and it looks like a big bay, and at low tide, it drains, and you get this wonderful salt marsh. How did we move from that to an aquatic park with sea-doos running around? Well, there was a discussion. There was an idea, okay? But not only do we create our own reality, make it under conditions of our own making, not only is reality constructed in communication, but reality is also contested in communication. And this is where power comes into play. So at a certain point, there was this idea, let's turn it into aquatic park for sea-doos, okay? And that won enough support, okay? And whenever an idea becomes dominant, it ends up kind of vanquishing the other possibilities. We talk about this in my media and conflict class a lot. So if people said, hey, let's keep it a wetland, or maybe we could have half and half. We could keep part of it wetland and part of it into an aquatic park, right? The winning idea, essentially, in order to win the day, it needs to kind of render the other options as less than. Or what happens in most power plays, deviant, or that other idea, that other claim to the situation, it's almost as though it doesn't exist, right? So communication is not just tells us about the world, it's where all social reality is constructed in and through communication. And it is also contested in and through communication. All social reality is the result of some degree of contestation, of some degree of difference about what should happen, who we are, who they are, what's the definition of the situation, where do we proceed from here, okay? There is never a unified notion of what those things should be, okay? In social reality and spirituality, that's a whole different conversation. But there's always dissenting views, there's always alternatives, okay? And to win the day, to become real, to become manifest, become material, the messages need to really kind of ultimately win, and you do that by vanquishing the other ideas. So reality is constructed in and through communication, and it is contested in and through communication. I'd be happy to talk more all about that for the rest of my life. I'm pretty committed to it. I should say that I was a history major as an undergraduate, and I loved history, and I have a master's in developmental psych and counseling, which I liked a little bit, but that's just me. But I love my history degree, and I think it's important to know that we can move through different disciplinary logic and different commitments, and I always loved the historical dimension, but I didn't always know why, right? But in terms of the way that history has a lot to do with the determination of meaning, with the way that a lot of social realities do not appear as though they are constructed, do not appear as though they were the result of contestation. Instead, so much social reality appears to us as though it's normal, natural, inevitable, and eternal, okay? The kind of common sense, that's just the way it is. So when we think about ideas of home, and we think about the fact of migration as a part of the human experience, okay, how we understand both of these ideas are constructed in our culture, are determined, or at least there's limits set upon them by history, by the world we've been given, about the sense of home that we've been given, the way that we might think about migration or immigrants. Those have been given to us, And I think it's important to note that that doesn't mean that history determines their meaning, okay? That they always already mean certain things, that home is always going to be a comfortable place, okay? Or that home is always going to be something that we strive for, okay? But instead that it's always the result of an ongoing process. It's always the result of an ongoing process, and that really only happens in and through the way that we speak about things, the way that we persuade, the way that we imagine things. So so that's like the first thing I want to make sure, when we talk about communication. It's really important to me. And again, I think that there are certain people in my department who would disagree. I would argue that the fundamental problematic of communication, in the sense that Luis Althusser talked about problematic as like a generative question, a kind of center question, Althusser talks about it as a mother question that gives viability and legitimacy to all the other questions you could ask in a discipline, okay? I think that the problematic of communication is, how is it that we achieve shared meaning? How do we achieve shared meaning? How is shared meaning constructed? How is it contested? Okay? Whose meanings are enabled? Whose meanings are limited in regular power dynamics? So this is why when I started studying communication, sometimes I go to other colleagues' talks. I'm like, I should have been a theologian, or I wish I was a Spanish literature scholar, but I'm not. I studied communication, and this is why. Home and migration are both the result of these processes from my perspective. They are constructed in our imaginations, and there's contestation around them. So just a second move when we think about a communication approach to this is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the text is always a window into the context. Okay, from a cultural studies perspective and how I was trained, how I do my work, the context is the object of study. Okay, so if you look at a news story, okay, or a video short about, the No Kings protests, okay, you could take apart the text itself. You could look at the video, right, and you can say, here's what's happening here, here's the way it was edited, okay? And that's interesting, but that really gives us a window in the broader context of Trumpism, the resistance to Trumpism, the seeming futility of approaching, the opposition party, the inevitability that people will claim in terms of, Trumpism's rise. This is the context in which your text gives you a window. So you study a text, and that gives you a window in the true object of study, which is the context. Again, people would argue with me, but that's my position. So when we think about both home and migration, what's the context? Okay, I mean, we could look at all kinds of windows, but I would say, that there's certain contextual ways, kind of clues. This isn't a study. Oh, sorry, I just want to make sure I can see my watch. This isn't a study, but we can start to understand a little bit more about the context, so that when we look at text, we could say, okay, that is showing us something about it. I would argue that when we think about both home as well as migration or immigration, the context is right-wing populism in the United States. It's right-wing populism. That is the best way to describe Trumpism. And everything that I've read, lots of people, I had a class, it was pretty interesting. I had a class that we were trying to figure it out. I had them read a piece I'll summarize in a second, but I said, this isn't a political science class, but let's put on the board, liberal, left of center, progressive, and on the other side, conservative, right of center, right-leaning, okay? And I said, what are some basic values on the kind of left of center, you'd say Democrats or whatever, however you'd want to describe it. Again, this isn't a thorough political science analysis, but just for the sake of conversation. Okay, what are some properties of this? Okay, yes, kind of like a big government has a big role, right? Government has a big role. There's an expansion of kind of opportunities and rights, and you need a state apparatus that can meet that expansion. I mean, it's kind of change-oriented, forward-looking, okay? And it's interested in making moves that way. It kind of is moving that way. Okay, great. There's more to be said, but that's the kind of cartoon version in class. And I said, what about right of center, conservative, your kind of classical GOP, the old GOP, right? And so what would that be? Okay, more limited government apparatus, caution about the expansion of states as well as the expansion of rights, a kind of traditionalism, a restraint that government, needs to be cautious about change. Fair enough, right? And I asked the students, well, where would you put Trumpism as a kind of political movement? I said, is it left of center liberal? And they said, no. And I said, is it kind of right of center, kind of conservative in this traditional sense of conservatism? And they said, no, right? It's populist. It's populist. It's populist. And I think that that's an important context for how we understand both home and migration. Sylvia Wasteboard, the journalism scholar, wrote a pretty great piece a few years ago where he studies mostly journalism in Latin America, and he makes the argument based on his analysis of left-wing populist movements in Latin America that populism, whether it is left or right, it's kind of agnostic, whether it's left or right. Populism itself is hard on democratic communication. It's hard on democratic communication, okay? And there's kind of three things that Wasteboard suggests in his analysis of all of these populist movements. One of the things that populism does is that it creates a unified notion of the people, okay? And in so doing, there's the people, and then there's them, okay? So whenever you unify a people, you're also necessarily kind of unifying who's not the people, okay? So that's a very important part of political populism, capital P, according to Wasteboard. The second is that you engage in a kind of politics of endless conflict, okay? There's very little stasis in populism. There's problems, right? And you engage with those problems. You construct the problem, and you attempt to, kind of find ways to resolve the problem. And then third, you erode notions of truth and truth-seeking institutions, okay? And so I think when we think about both home or homeland, as well as migration, we have to understand that that's the context, right? So if I was to really kind of think about a text, I would be looking at how it's in dialogue or how it illuminates this larger context of right-wing populism, okay? In terms of both immigration and home, and I realize I don't have too much more time, when I think about both immigration and home, home is something that is deeply constructed and contested in the culture. And I would say that these days, in terms of right-wing populism here and around the world, it's homeland, right? This idea, this kind of nostalgic, ethno-racial, religious notion of territory, right, and belonging somewhere. Migration, of course, in our contemporary political context, is kind of torn asunder from home, right? The immigrant is the other who doesn't belong in the homeland, and the immigrant needs to be cast out of the home, okay? And that's really interesting to me because traditionally the way that immigration has been in migration, which again is a fact of the human experience, immigration is constructed and contested the way we would identify a truth, okay, of the long-form human experience. We define it as, it's defined or contested as, we bring it meaning as immigration around nation states. Immigration and home really kind of go together, right? The idea of an immigrant belonging somewhere suggests not so much a homeland, but an actual domestic place, a home, a place to belong. And I have just two brief examples. The first is this notion of Aztlán in the Chicano imaginary, okay? So this came about in the 1960s and 1970s as Chicano civil rights movements. Many Mexican-American young people in the U.S. Southwest made claims that this is where we belong. We're not strangers here. This is a place that we belong. And that Aztlán is a kind of mythical paradise, a homeland of the Mixtec, of the Olmecs, of what we think of as the Aztec people, right? That this is actually a place where people belong. This is a home and a homeland, the southern part of the United States, northern Mexico, right? So again, this is a kind of empowering discourse to say, no, we belong here. We are not just coming back or passing through. This is a homeland. And the other example I'll give is the Tenement Museum in New York City, which I think is just like a fantastic use of a very small old tenement, a 19th century tenement in Lower Manhattan. I took a group there. What's interesting is that we also went to Ellis Island as part of our experience. And Ellis Island is this beautiful compound, gorgeous 19th century building, huge, expansive. It's a wonderful facility. It's just kind of amazing, okay? And the tour that we got was so bad. The tour was about the United States more than it was about the people who arrived, okay? So it's just like such a wasted opportunity, okay? And not really a sense of home. There's no sense of home here. There's a sense of kind of admission, okay, and the difficulties of admission. The Tenement Museum reconstructs a 19th century tenement and uses a small museum and uses the different apartments to tell different stories over 100 years of people who have lived there. Okay, and you see I'm thinking of Dolores Hayden's book, Power of Place, from the late 1990s, like really important ways of thinking about working class history and immigrant history. It's about often the home and where people lived, where people worked. The Tenement Museum, what they're able to do with this building to tell stories is rather remarkable. And you learn about people's everyday life. I think it's important to note that the museum for a long time was kind of like attached to the stories of European immigrants who, German, Italian, Irish, who lived there. And that's important because that's who lived in that building. But they have, especially over the last 5 or 10 years, expanded their stories to more Black New Yorkers, to more Chinese American, Asian American, Latino New Yorkers, who didn't necessarily live in the tenement, but they create the narrative about their domestic life. So I think it's really interesting because so much of the way that we might understand the reality of migration and the immigrant experiences is this sense of home and the home that people create somewhere else, right? The way that they build community, the way that they create bonds, the way that they move into a community, right? Become part of the fabric of a community. But in a lot of ways, the kind of notion of national heritage and migration are working against each other. National heritage, more and more these days, comes to represent, the opposite of human movement, and a kind of short memory around who belongs and who doesn't belong. So happy to talk more about it as we go. I'm going to skip the video and hand it over to Rebecca.
My name is Rebecca Cazares. I'm the Director of Cross-Border Initiatives at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, and I'm really happy to be here. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Is that better? Yeah? Well, my topic today is diasporas, deportations, and the question of home in Tijuana. So also taking a little bit from the idea of how we communicate who's a migrant, who's a refugee, how we conceptualize the idea of migration and why people are here, have a large role on how we shape what happens with these communities, right, and their opportunities in places like Tijuana. So the three things I want to talk about today is how do different migrant and diasporic communities in Tijuana have adapted to life there, how shifting policies shape the possibilities for integrating and thriving in a place like Tijuana, and what does the border teach us about home in motion. I'm going to talk about three particular communities, not because they're the only ones, but they have been established in Tijuana for a little bit longer. These are the communities that I've had the privilege to work with a little bit more closely. And as we mentioned, we have a Border Fellows program, and these are usually the communities that our fellows work more closely with. So these populations would be deportees, and I'll make the distinction between people who have been deported and the population of deported veterans that lives in Tijuana. There are a few key differences that make that population very distinctive. I'm also talking about the Haitian population in Tijuana and the Central American population of migrants in Tijuana. I'm going to touch on some of the border dynamics, some of the migration dynamics, not to go too much into detail. There's a lot to unpack here, but just to give you a general context. Also, some of the policies that have been in place. I'll mention the ones that have impacted locally the most, especially Tijuana, and how these communities are, have settled in Tijuana, the impact that these policies have had on them. So mostly I want to start by talking about how deportations and asylum bottlenecks have anchored thousands of people, especially since 2016, 2018. Like it was mentioned, I used to work at an NGO in Tijuana called Rebeca. It is a community clinic and a harm reduction clinic. I started working there in 2014. So it was mostly men, mostly people who had been deported. It was, like I mentioned, a harm reduction clinic. So we provided services for people who used injectable substances. And this is what we saw, most of the time. And then 2016, 2018 started changing dramatically the population dynamics and the type of people that we saw as a migrant-serving organization. So some of the things that stand out is that between these populations, we see people who are fleeing violence, poverty, persecution, and political instability, like places like Haiti and El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. They make their way through Mexico, so we see increased detention, containment, criminalization. This didn't used to be such a regular part of Mexican migration policy. It's always been a problem, but the pressure from the United States to contain migrants in Mexico definitely increased during this time, and there was an externalization of border policy to Mexico. So we saw more and more violent practices from the Mexican government as well to contain migration. So that would mean that we would re-expose these communities to more violence, and they would be more vulnerable in general. There's also a very notable lack of sufficient legal mechanisms to seek asylum as these numbers grew. There was this sense, and this rhetoric mostly, that there was a migrant crisis. But we saw, and I'm going to point this out later, when we had refugees from Ukraine, and in this case, for instance, people were more inclined to call them refugees than migrants, on how this was, to some extent, or for the most part, an administrative crisis more than a migrant crisis that could have been handled differently. So when this happened, bottlenecks started, getting more complicated. We saw people getting more desperate, using unsafer routes or unsafer mechanisms to try to get to the United States. And then if they got there, they would be faced often with detention and deportation. This is, of course, has gotten a lot more complicated throughout this past few years. We saw different trends during different administrations. We saw in 2012 was the biggest peak back in the Obama administration of deportations. Keep in mind that the data is kind of muddled, really. Deportations here include both people who are detained at the border and turned back, and also people who are internally detained and then processed and deported back to either Mexico or their home countries. Practices have changed radically, between these administrations and these times. But there were some key factors that influence these, like COVID policies, like Title 42, which used a public health rationale, or it wasn't really about public health, but it was used as an excuse to keep more people from trying to cross. It was later turned back to Title 8, which is what's in place now, and it was what it was in place before. And then there was a big slowdown, both because of the pandemic, but also policy. And right now, well, we've seen in the news what's going on with the ICE raids and all the containment has definitely changed. Again, the dynamics, and the demographic of what the majority of these communities were, if they're trying to get to the border, who they are, and what is going on with them. Just very quickly, like I mentioned, pre 9/11, we saw a lot less restriction. mostly men. There was circular migration, so there was a lot of agricultural workers who would come to the U.S., work seasonally, and then were able to come back. And then during the Obama administration, we saw that big spike in deportations. There were significant restrictions. We saw more and more unaccompanied minors. A lot of this had to do with what was going on also with certain nations. If there had been, for instance, natural disasters, they were migrating and families were being separated and migrating at different times. A lot of these spikes also had to do with people trying to reunite with their families and how difficult that started getting. Ken mentioned 2016, we saw more migrants from Haiti. These were migrants who had been, migrating for a while. They had either gone through Brazil when the soccer stadium was being built, and then they moved to Chile, and then to Mexico, because they thought they would get be part of the temporary protection program, which they didn't. So that's how the first big stall happened. Then we had the mass migration from Central America in 2018. And the way that these populations or these communities were perceived and received, the resources that were deployed to be able to provide services changed a lot, and it had a lot to do with, again, with communication, with how we think about these communities, and also who was in power at that time, controlling these or being louder about certain narratives. We saw policies that shaped the way that these communities were able to move, like the Migrant Protection Protocol. Initially, there was this thing called metering. People would go to the border to try to seek asylum, and what was told to them mostly is that they did not have the capacity to process that many migrants at a time. So it would be something like 5, 10, 12 migrants every day. You would have to take a number and wait for your turn. And that's usually how they stayed in Tijuana, just waiting for their turn. However, later on, when we saw refugees from Ukraine, for instance, we saw that over like 100, 150 applications were able to be processed daily. They didn't stay in Tijuana for that very long. In fact, they didn't even stay in Tijuana. They were moved to Mexico City because they didn't deem Tijuana to be safe enough for them. So that differential treatment was very palpable on both sides. On the Tijuana side as well, it was, I was still working at the organization from Casa back then, and it was just a few blocks away. The encampment for both of these communities was at this sports unit. They have a soccer field and a basketball court. And when the Central American caravan arrived, they were made to stay outside in the fields. It actually wasn't a soccer stadium yet; it was just dirt. So they had the encampment there. But when we had the people from Ukraine who were fleeing the war, they were able to stay inside the court. They had cots. It was, it's, like I mentioned, the differential treatment was very palpable, unfortunately, for on both sides of the border. Of course, COVID also had a lot to do with how things shaped out and people being able to move or travel, getting sick, etc. And then we saw increased deportations again in 2021, 2022. Most of these were, because Title 42 was still in place, were people who were being detained at the border and then turned back. So a lot of times when we see those spikes, it's difficult to really make up what was going on, because the same person could go back and try over and over again, and those numbers don't differentiate from from that situation. So during this, the last 3 years, we saw the end of Title 42, going back to Title 8, which basically just meant that it was, even more restrictions and more penalty for people who are trying to cross irregularly or present themselves at the border. We saw the CBP-1 app, which had a lot of issues with language, with use, people waiting to get an appointment. The app is no longer working. It's more of a self-deportation tool at the time. We also, during 2024, saw asylum restrictions for irregular crossings being even more difficult, more enforced. And then this year, we saw the big, beautiful act, which is difficult. The name is difficult to say, but the budget was an increase in $170 billion to enforce all of these policies and to come up with new ones to paint more migration. So there's definitely been a big decrease because of all of this. I already mentioned what these are, but just very briefly, the first one in 1996, the Immigration Restriction Act in 1996 is one of the first or more significant ones that had to do with deporting migrants and the population that we saw before 2012 that was living in Tijuana. There was, like I mentioned, deported veterans, for instance, were usually deported under this act. And then we saw the Secure Communities Act in 2008, and this was before that big spike in 2012 as well. So just institutional mass deportations. These were two big ones before we saw things like MPP and Title 42. And now we face, renewed large-scale deportations, even though the flow from the south is less now. The people who are in Tijuana or who are at the border can expect either from the south and installed there, or from the north and again installed in Tijuana, just because of the proximity to the U.S. So the question is, what happens to the people who stay in Tijuana? How do they, how they survive a lot of the times, and how do they make that home while they're still trying to move? A lot of them do decide to stay there, but it is definitely a struggle. So one of the first communities I wanted to mention was deportees and people who and deported veterans. So according to many researchers, this is one of the most difficult migrant communities at the border to be able to integrate. They face what they call a double. There's this. Sorry, I'm blanking out on the word, but they face both losing their home and coming back to a place that they mostly don't know. Most of the people who we talk to who have been deported at the border are usually people who were brought to the United States as children or have been there and made a life for themselves for a really long time. When I worked at the clinic, I had a lot of patients that were born in Mexico, were undocumented in the U.S., and didn't even speak Spanish. A lot of the services that were provided had to be in English because Spanish wasn't actually their first language, but they also didn't have U.S. citizenship. They had been out of Mexico for so long that they didn't have their birth certificate anymore or didn't know anyone in Mexico anymore. So they found themselves, in a completely strange place, isolated, away from family. A lot of them had gone through very difficult situations, trauma, especially in the case of veterans. So just grappling with stigma, with laws. There's not, of course, not everyone, but there is a good percentage of people in this situation that that do struggle with substance use, and like I mentioned, PTSD, trauma, depression, etc. So there's this added stigma of them not belonging anywhere and being and trying to survive in this state. So these are one of the people who have been in Tijuana the longest and are neither from, or don't feel like they're either from here or there, different from the Chicano population, for instance. In Tijuana, there's not that sense of identity or home, and that has a huge impact on them being able to thrive, to integrate, to what happens to their health and their well-being. Between 200 and 700 deported veterans currently live in or in transit through Tijuana, according to from data from 2024. However, this, again, is really difficult to estimate. This is a very mobile population. Most of them were lawful permanent residents in the U.S. That were part of the U.S. Armed Forces, but were deported under the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, the one I mentioned in 1986, especially after minor convictions or administrative infractions, things like transit tickets, things like that. And a good portion were also not in any sort of violation. Over 60% of deported veterans in Tijuana suffer from PTSD or depression, and fewer than 10% receive regular health care or mental health care. Persistent activism by Tijuana-based veterans contributed to the 2017 and 2019 U.S. military access and repatriation project, but this was the work that took to do this took decades, probably. The people who had been involved in this and drafting this and making this happen, it was just so many people either passed away or never got to see the results from this act. There's an article you can check out. I'll leave some of the materials if you're interested. This is a study. I mentioned I'm part of this binational research team that looks at the environmental impact and the structural violence in the Tijuana River Canal and the population that lives in the Tijuana River Canal. Back in Casa, the needle exchange program was around, I think it was 68 or nearly 70% of the people that came to the needle exchange program were people who had been deported in the U.S. Like I mentioned, a lot of high rates of trauma, depression, PTSD. So in this environment, it's something conductive to substance use and not being able to access the right services to treat it. And with the last year's added complication of fentanyl and more border security, militarization, et cetera, had made life for this population a lot more difficult. So one of the things I wanted to, it's not the topic for this discussion, but just to keep in mind, there's always talk about how to treat the environmental issues in the Tijuana River Canal, and this is a population that is often overlooked and it's just invisible. So the solutions that people think of when it comes to water, sanitation, beaches, etc., also need to always include what happens to that population of people who are living in the Tijuana River Canal, because it is a binational problem. These are people who are both from the U.S. and Mexico, and whatever policies are in place to deal with this issue affects them. And usually the default is, let's just get them out, and it's important that it looks pretty and that they don't cause any problems. But there's no infrastructure to take care of the people who are in this situation. So just wanted to mention that, to keep in mind. The other two populations, or the other two groups that I wanted to talk about I mentioned were the Haitian population and Central Americans. This is I really like this photo. This is Irving is this man from Honduras that was here during the first migrant caravan, and he now is working at one of the shelters in Tijuana. There's this group called Via Internacional that has different shelters in Tijuana, and he's just an amazing person, activist for migrant communities. So I want to talk a little bit about how these communities themselves are doing, all that they can to have their communities thrive at a place that has, very little to offer in terms of offering or facilitating a home for people who are in transit. When it comes to the Haitian population, I can mention it was between 2016 and 2018, over 20,000 Haitians arrived in Tijuana and Mexicali, and they had relocated following the 2010 earthquake. More followed, but this initial population was basically the population who could afford to move. They were able to work in Brazil and Chile, so they saved up. Usually there were people who their educational level was a little bit higher. It was they were basically fleeing the results from the earthquake. The people that followed were the people who were not able to move during this time, and they were definitely in a more precarious situation, which was interesting because the reception and how people viewed them in Tijuana was very, very different from this first group, from the people that came after. Additionally, it was at the same time that the Central American caravan was going. So the numbers, the strain on resources, it has a lot to do with how people embraced or not certain populations. So the Haitian diaspora is now estimated at between 7,000 and 10,000 residents in the border, or in Tijuana, actually. This is Little Haiti is one of the places where most of the Haitian population is who mostly newly arrived are living, but a lot of them have integrated in Tijuana. 70% of Haitian migrants work in the informal sector, mostly because they still have issues being able to get Mexican ID numbers, permanent residency. There's a lot of racial discrimination that makes this a lot more difficult. Language barriers, etc., have made this a real issue for the Haitian population. However, there's still been a big rise in Haitian churches, cultural centers, mutual aid groups. There are lots of Haitian-owned restaurants, barber shops, etc. So over 60% of Haitians in Tijuana plan to remain in Mexico for the long term. It still doesn't mean that it's been easy, but they've been here for a little longer, and different policies have either made this easier or harder. When it comes to Central American caravans, it definitely has been a little bit more complicated. By 2019, nearly 30% of asylum seekers in Baja California were Central American nationals. They, like most people from Latin America, Mexico, have that stereotype of being very loud, of being just happy people, and this, for some reason, at some point also just bothered some people and did it, contribute to a certain negative image of this population. We're not liking the food in Mexico, or not integrating the way that people expected, like the Haitian population, which seemed to just be a little bit quieter, more complacent, more. So these stereotypes and ideas of certain groups started forming around these times as well. During the time that MPP was sort of was in place, around 70,000 asylum seekers had to wait at the border to have their cases heard. A lot of them were never processed. In the case of Central American migrants, there's unfortunately, particularly for women in the LGBTQ plus community, are to the community or sub-communities that have faced some of the biggest threats when it comes to violence. They're easily targeted for extortion, trafficking, etc. So this is also being still a very big issue with this population. Surveys conducted found that roughly 40% of Central American migrants in Tijuana no longer plan to cross to the U.S., and many do plan on staying in Tijuana. So what are some of the things that have either helped or made this integration a little bit more difficult? According to some researchers, legal recognition, economic stability, safety, health, and access to health, social networks, and cultural acceptance play a big role. So I made a big table summarizing some of the information that I already said. I'm sorry if it looks like too much. So just to point out some of the most important ones, I added, for comparison, Ukrainian refugees. Like I mentioned, even just the fact that I sort of did that intentionally, the fact that they're called refugees as opposed to other refugees or migrants. They were granted humanitarian parole and temporary protection a lot more easy. So physically it was, and emotionally it was just incredibly difficult for these other communities who had been waiting, some of them for years, for their asylum cases to be processed and heard. Just seeing them at the border, how mostly European migrants would, just pass by like it was nothing. So it was very difficult to watch, and what followed from that was also very difficult for migrant servant organizations and the people who are providing services, because people got more and more desperate. I mentioned I worked at a clinic, so during this time, asylum cases for Central Americans and Haitian migrants were stalled, and the only reason they would be able to cross was for humanitarian parole, which basically meant if they had a large medical reason or emergency, they would maybe be able to cross in order to take care of the medical reason. So the clinics, we had 2 clinics locally that provided services for migrants, and they got completely flooded by people wanting. Rumors started spreading that they could get a letter saying that they had a health concern or a health issue, and that they would be able to cross with this. Or all the clinics got flooded with people just saying, I have a certain health condition. People who did have health conditions stopped taking their meds, would get sicker, or would try to just be able to get across through humanitarian parole. I'm sorry, from misinformation and miscommunication. So it affected not only them in the time that they were here, but also physically their health, mentally their health, and also just the resources overall were also affected. Like I mentioned, deported veterans also, I think it's important to point out the identity and sense of self is also a big difference sometimes between the groups. Like I mentioned, deportees don't feel like they're either from here or there. But the deported veterans, in the research, there was the sense of like them being exiled Americans, because they do feel that sense of identity with America. They fought for American in a war, but they would still not granted citizenship. So they felt this sense of exile. When it comes to Central American migrants, there's a lot of this sense of them being refugees of violence or workers in transit. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of rhetoric of them, being linked to crime, to maras, or to organized crime mostly. With Asian migrants, the Afro-Caribbean diaspora builders was part of that sense of identity, as opposed to European refugees and victims of war when it comes to Ukrainian refugees. I mentioned some of the economic integration, some of the things that these communities have been able to achieve. It's common for deportees or deported veterans, if they're in a good position or favorable position, that they work in call centers or things where English, for instance, is a tool for them. But a lot of times, unfortunately, like I mentioned, there's a big problem of unhoused deportees and deported veterans in Tijuana that do not participate in this integration. What am I missing here? Just some of the unique challenges for Haitian migrants. Like I mentioned, there is definitely language barriers, racism involved, difficult for them to become regularized because of those barriers. Lack of housing and credit access, economic precarity. Some of the other populations or nationalities often have ties in Mexico or near the U.S., so integration in that sense was a little bit easier. But when it comes to the perception, it was and the reception of them in Mexico, it's been a little bit more difficult. Let's see. So finally, with the prospect of new deportations, I mention a lot of these services are already overextended. For deported veterans and long-term U.S. residents, another enforcement surge could mean the return. This is what I wanted to say. I'm sorry. Double exile, being exiled from their country or the place where they call home, and end up in a place they don't really know. So they feel constantly exiled from both. For Haitian, Central Americans, and Venezuelans, increased removals could sever families further and push many deeper into informality. Like I mentioned, not being able to have identity to be legal, to have legal citizenship, just drives them more into informality. And a lot of it has also been not actually wanting to stay in Mexico or just seeing it as a place of transit has also stalled a lot of people with integrating and looking for services or a way to have their migratory situation regular in Mexico, because they've been wanting to move to the U.S. for so long that it eventually just makes it more difficult for them to integrate. Local NGOs warn that infrastructure, like shelters, clinics, and advocacy networks, will not withstand another policy shock like the one that we might have now. And next Tuesday, I wanted to say, we have a talk about the resilience of migrant servant organizations that have worked to provide services for migrants during this time. So if you're interested and want to check it out, it's next Tuesday at noon at the Kroc School. And finally, amid all of these limited resources, shifting policies, people who are migrating, deportees, and locals together construct a fragile but real sense of home. As the specter of these new mass deportations are coming, the question facing policymakers are not only what they'll do when this happens, but what to do with the communities and the populations who have already established are established in Tijuana. And for those who have been displaced, this is another big migrant population also stalled at the border who wanted to cross to the U.S. And it's now in Tijuana is just people from Mexico who have been internally displaced because of violence, especially places like Guerrero or Michoacan, where there's a lot of cartel violence. They have been displaced and are now at the border and are, in a very similar situation. And again, how the concepts that we use and how we think of migration has a lot to do with what opportunities they have. So it is the place, basically in Tijuana, where they have, against the law, it's made the border into their home. I added this quote. I don't think anyone in Tijuana, it's a very famous one, but I don't think anyone actually knows who said it. She was a poet, I think, but I don't know her name. It says, Tijuana is a corner where all dreams bounce, and a place so needed of peace.